The cages smelled like iron and rain. That was the first thing I noticed when the heavy oak doors swung open and the underground passage breathed its cold air against my face. Iron, rain, and something else beneath both. Something wild. Something alive in a way that made the skin at the back of my neck prickle as though a hand had pressed there without warning. I gripped the handle of my wooden bucket tighter and stepped inside. The corridor stretched long and low, lit by torches that guttered and spat in the draft from the door closing behind me. The stone floor was dark with moisture, the walls slick, and the ceiling close enough that a tall man would have to bow his head to walk. I was not tall. I had never been described as anything remarkable, truthfully. Not tall, not striking, not the kind of woman who drew eyes when she entered a room. I was Sadie, the keep's newest servant, 3 weeks arrived from a village so small it didn't appear on any cartographer's map, hired on as a general scrubbing hand because the steward had been desperate and I had been willing. I had not been told, during that hiring, that willing would one day mean this. Cages cleaned by dawn, the head housekeeper Marta had said that morning, not looking up from her ledger. Her voice had the texture of old gravel. Buckets are by the kitchen door. Don't linger. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't touch anything that growls. She'd said the last part so flatly that I had almost laughed. Almost. Now, standing in the corridor with the torchlight throwing my shadow long and shaking on the stones, I did not feel like laughing at all. The cages were on either side, 6 in total, 3 on each wall, separated by iron bars thicker than my wrist. They were enormous, each one large enough to house something that was not quite animal and not quite man. I had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in the kingdom had heard the stories. The Lycan King's wolves, his bound warriors, his elite guard in their most primal form, were kept below the east tower during the full moon's approach, not because they were prisoners, but because the king himself had ordered it. For the safety of the castle, they said. For the protection of servants and nobles alike, they said. What they did not say, but everyone understood, was this. During the 3 days before the full moon, the wolves were not entirely themselves, and the king trusted no one's safety to chance. I could hear them breathing. Low, slow, rhythmic. The breath of creatures much larger than what the bars implied. In the dimness, shapes shifted. I caught the glint of eyes before the torchlight steadied, amber and pale green, and one pair that was almost silver, watching me from the darkness with an attention that was uncomfortably intelligent. Don't touch anything that growls. I set down my bucket, lifted my scrubbing cloth, and began with the floor just outside the first cage. His name, I would learn later, was Corvin. At that moment he was only a shape, broad-shouldered even in stillness, crouched near the back of his cage with his arms resting on his knees, watching me the way a hawk watches something far below it on an open field. Not hungry, just aware. "You're new," he said. His voice was lower than I expected. Rougher. But his words were clear and deliberate, the voice of a man who chose each one carefully. I did not look up. I am. The last one ran. I paused for only a moment, then kept scrubbing. That seems inconvenient for everyone. A silence. Then, from deeper in the corridor, something that might have been a low sound of amusement from another cage, quickly suppressed. Corvin shifted, the straw rustling beneath him. "You're not frightened." It wasn't a question, and it wasn't entirely accurate. My hands were steady only because I had spent years making them steady. Because in a house with a father who drank and a mother who disappeared into herself, you learn to keep your hands still even when everything inside you is moving. You learn to look calm the way a lake looks calm while a current runs beneath it. "I'm working," I said. It was the most honest answer I could give. I moved to the second cage. The warrior inside was lying on his side, one arm thrown over his eyes, and he did not speak to me or acknowledge me in any way. I was grateful for that. I cleaned the floor outside his bars in silence, then moved on. The third cage held a young man. He could not have been much older than 25, with copper-red hair and eyes that were currently more gold than anything human, who was pacing. Back and forth, 3 steps in turn, 3 steps in turn, the rhythm of someone fighting something internal. He stopped when I reached his section. "Don't look at me directly," he said, low and tight. "Please." I kept my gaze on the floor. "I won't. Thank you." His voice cracked slightly on the second word, and I understood then that his request had not been arrogance. It had been a warning, a precaution. Something in him was close to the surface tonight, and he was asking me to help him keep it contained. "What's your name?" I asked, still not looking up. "Brennan. I'm Sadie." Another pause. "You should be careful," Brennan said softly. "Not of us. Of being seen here. By him." I looked up then, only briefly, only at the ceiling, as if considering the stone above us. By who? But Brennan had stopped pacing and pressed himself against the back wall of his cage, and I felt it before I understood it. A change in the air, a shift in pressure, the way the torches along the wall suddenly burned straighter and brighter, as if called to attention. A door at the far end of the corridor opened. Footsteps. One set, unhurried, and yet the sound of them filled the passage in a way that 24 hurrying footsteps never could. It was the step of someone who occupied space differently than other people, who moved through a room and had the room know it. I kept my head down, kept scrubbing. The footsteps slowed, stopped. I could feel him looking at me. I could feel it the way you feel the sun move from behind a cloud. Not warmth exactly, but presence. The sudden awareness of something that had been there all along now making itself known. I did not look up. "Who sent this one?" His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It was the kind of voice that the room itself seemed to lean toward. And I understood in that moment why they called him king not only by title, but by nature. Some people are given power. Some people simply are power, and the rest of the world eventually catches up to that fact. No one answered him. I realized after a beat of silence that he was speaking to the room, or perhaps to me. Slowly, I sat back on my heels and looked up. Leander, King of Lycans, Lord of the Eastern Territories, stood at the end of the corridor with a torch at his back that turned his outline gold and left his face in partial shadow. He was taller than I'd expected, which was saying something, given the stories, and broader, with the kind of presence that made the underground corridor feel suddenly like an intimate space rather than a passage. His hair was dark, his jaw unshaved and sharp, and his eyes, even at this distance, caught the torchlight and held it in a way that was not entirely human. Those eyes were on me, not on my bucket, not on the cage, on me, with an expression I couldn't read, not anger, not suspicion, but something more complex, something that moved behind his gaze like weather behind glass. "You," he said, still quiet, still utterly certain of being heard. I realized my mouth was dry. "Marta sent me," I said. My voice came out steadier than I deserved. "To clean the cages, sire." The word sire came a half-beat late, and I saw something shift in his expression, almost a reaction. Gone before I could name it. Marta sent a woman alone to the lower ward. It was not a question. It was a recitation of a fact that displeased him, delivered in the flat tone of someone who would be having a conversation with Marta very shortly. "I volunteered," I said, which was true, though the full truth was that I had volunteered because the other servants had been whispering and pale-faced, and none of them would move toward the door. And someone had to. And I had grown tired of waiting for someone to be that person. Silence from the corridor, silence from the cages, even Corvin now still and watchful. Leander took one step forward, and I had the absurd, irrational thought that the torches actually brightened in response. His gaze moved, briefly, deliberately, to Corvin's cage, to Brennan's, sweeping the corridor with the assessment of someone checking on things he considers his, before returning to me. "Stand up," he said. I stood. He was closer now than I'd realized. The distance between us collapsed in that one step, and I could see his eyes clearly. Dark amber, almost brown, ringed with something that flickered when the torch moved. He looked at me the way Corvin had looked at me, but with a depth that was different. Not the hawk's awareness. Something older than that. Something that recognized before it understood. "Your name, Sadie." He said nothing for a long moment. The corridor breathed around us, iron and cold stone, and the low sounds of the wolves settling back into their quiet. Then he looked down at my bucket, at the scrubbing cloth still clutched in my hand, and something crossed his face. Brief, unguarded, gone in an instant. "Finish," he said quietly. "Then report to Marta that you are to be reassigned." He turned. "She touches them," he said, to no one, to the corridor, to himself, in a voice low enough that it barely carried. And yet I heard it, every word, clear as a bell in that underground silence. "Because she is mine to place where I will." He walked away. I stood in the flickering light, cloth in hand, heart somewhere in my throat, and stared at the space he had left behind. From Corvin's cage, very quietly, "I did warn you. I did not sleep well that night. The straw mattress in the servants' quarters had never been comfortable. It was thin and smelled faintly of dust and the lavender Marta insisted on tucking into every corner of the keep, as though fragrance alone could soften stone. But I had grown accustomed to it in 3 weeks. I had grown accustomed to the sounds of the other women breathing around me, to the distant clang of the night watch, changing at the gate, to the particular creak of the 3rd floorboard near the window that always spoke before dawn. That night, none of it reached me. I lay on my back and stared at the ceiling, and thought about the way his voice had sounded in that corridor. "She is mine to place where I will." I turned the words over and over, examining them the way you examine a stone pulled from a riverbed, looking for what they actually meant beneath what they appeared to mean. It was a possessive statement about a servant, a declaration of authority over the placement of keep staff. That was the rational interpretation, and I applied it firmly and set the memory aside. It did not stay set aside. By the time gray light began leaking under the door, I had accepted that I was not going to sleep, dressed quietly so as not to wake the others, and made my way to the kitchen to help with the morning bread. Marta found me there an hour later. She stood in the kitchen doorway with her ledger under her arm, and her expression arranged into its customary severity. But there was something around her eyes, a tightness, a question she hadn't yet decided to ask, that told me she already knew. "The king spoke to me before second bell," she said, without preamble. I kept my hands moving in the dough. "I assumed he would. You are reassigned." She paused, and I heard the reluctance in it, the way she had to push slightly to get the next words out. "To the East Tower. Personal service to the ward." I looked up then. The East Tower. The cages. Not a single morning visit as an emergency measure, but ongoing, assigned, deliberate. Marta met my eyes for exactly 1 second before returning to her ledger. "You will report there each morning at first light and again at dusk, for the 3 days remaining before the full moon. You will bring water, clean straw, food provisions. You will not engage the ward occupants in extended conversation. You will not—" She stopped, pressed her lips together, then continued. "You will not do anything that draws further attention." I understood what she meant by further. I understood that something had already been drawn, and she was trying, in her gravel-voiced way, to keep the situation from becoming something she couldn't manage in her ledger. "Yes, Marta," I said. She left without another word. The woman beside me at the bread table, Petra, 18, round-cheeked and curious about everything, waited until Marta's footsteps faded entirely before leaning close. "The East Tower," Petra whispered, with the tone of someone delivering a verdict. "Sadie, the East Tower." I heard. No one goes to the East Tower voluntarily. No one is sent there unless... She stopped, reconsidered, lowered her voice further. "They say the king himself sometimes walks that corridor at night, during the moon days." "He did last night," I said simply. Petra made a small sound like a door hinge and said nothing else for a very long time. I returned to the East Tower at dusk, as instructed. The corridor felt different in the evening light, warmer somehow, the torches burning amber rather than the cold orange of early morning, shadows pooling in the corners with more weight. I carried a wooden yoke with 2 pails of fresh water, a basket of provisions, and a bundle of clean straw tucked under one arm, and I moved through the door with the deliberate steadiness that had become something like armor for me over the years. Corvin was awake. He was always, I would come to understand, awake, or at least present in a way that made sleep seem like something that happened to lesser creatures. He was seated cross-legged near the bars when I arrived, turning something small between his fingers. A carved piece of dark wood I saw when the torchlight caught it, a wolf's head, small enough to sit in a closed fist. He watched me set down the pails with the expression of a man who had decided to find something interesting. "You came back," he said. "I was reassigned. By the king. By Marta." I began distributing the provisions: bread, dried meat, a hard cheese wrapped in cloth, sliding them through the small access panel at the base of each cage. "Marta manages the keep's assignments." "Marta manages what the king permits her to manage," Corvin said, not unkindly. He accepted his provisions without looking at them. "There's a difference." I moved to the next cage. The man inside, the one who had ignored me that morning, lying with his arm over his eyes, was sitting up now. He was older than Corvin, perhaps mid-30s, with a close-cropped dark beard and an expression that seemed permanently positioned somewhere between exhaustion and amusement. His eyes were pale gray, almost colorless, and they tracked me with the same quiet attention as Corvin's, though differently shaped. Where Corvin's watchfulness was the hawk's, this man's was the scholar's, cataloging, filing, waiting for the pattern to complete. "Rowan," he said, when I slid his provisions through, not introducing himself so much as correcting an omission. "You didn't know my name this morning." "I didn't," I agreed. "Rowan." He nodded once, as though that settled something. Brennan, in the third cage, was less tightly wound than the previous night. The worst of the moon pressure, I would learn, came in waves, and this was a quieter hour for him. His copper hair was disheveled, and his eyes were still more gold than brown. But he accepted his food with a murmured word of thanks, and sat near enough to the bars to talk, though he kept his gaze carefully angled away. "The others are on the far side," he told me, nodding toward the corridor's second half. "Gareth, he won't speak to you. It's not personal. He doesn't speak to anyone except the king. And Aldrich. Be careful with Aldrich." "Why?" Brennan considered. "He's not unkind, but he tests people. Ask questions that don't have comfortable answers. If you don't want to be tested, don't engage." I filed this away and moved to the far side of the corridor. Gareth was exactly as described. A massive, dark-skinned warrior with a shaved head and eyes the color of storm clouds, who watched my approach, watched me distribute provisions, and offered not a single syllable in response. His silence was not hostile. It was simply complete, the silence of a man who had long ago decided that words were an extravagance. I respected it. Aldrich was in the last cage. He was leaner than the others, long-limbed and angular, with sharp features and light brown eyes, that immediately sharpened when I came into view. He was perhaps 30, and everything about him suggested a mind that moved faster than the room around it. "Interesting," he said, before I had reached his cage. "Provisions," I said, crouching to slide his food through the panel. "I don't mean the bread." He tilted his head. "You're not afraid." "I've been told that." "Most people are afraid," he said conversationally. "Even the ones who pretend. You can always tell. The breath changes, the hands shake even when the face doesn't. Your hands don't shake." I looked up at him directly. "Did you want me to be frightened?" Something sparked in his eyes. Not irritation, not offense, closer to delight. "No," he said. "I find it refreshing. I'm simply cataloging." "Rowan does that too," I observed. Aldrich glanced toward the other side of the corridor with an expression that might have been fond. "Rowan taught me everything I know about observation. Whether that's a compliment or a confession depends on the day." Despite myself, despite every practical intention, I almost smiled. "Sadie," I offered. "I know," Aldrich said. "The king mentioned your name this morning." The words landed quietly and sat there in the air between us. I kept my expression neutral. "Did he?" "Only once." Aldrich studied me with those two perceptive eyes. "He said it the way people say things they're trying to say casually, which is always the least casual way to say anything." I stood, gathered my empty basket, and met his gaze evenly. "Good night, Aldrich." His smile was slow and genuine, and slightly dangerous. "Good night, Sadie." I was nearly to the corridor door when I heard the far entrance open. The sound I had come to recognize in less than 24 hours, the footstep that changed a room's pressure simply by existing in it. I did not turn around, but I stopped because the footsteps stopped too, and the silence that followed was the kind that required acknowledgement. "You learned their names," said Leander's voice, somewhere behind and to my left. It wasn't a question. It was something else, something I couldn't immediately name, spoken too quietly to carry any clear emotion and yet somehow carrying all of them at once. "It seemed polite," I said, to the door in front of me. A long pause. The torches breathed. "Turn around," he said. I turned. He was closer than I'd expected again. He had a way of crossing distance that didn't announce itself the way other people's movement did. In the evening torchlight, he looked less like a figure of authority and more like a figure of weight, as if everything in him had been compressed to its densest possible form over a very long time. His eyes found mine immediately and stayed. "No one learns their names," he said. "The servants who come down here, if they come, they don't ask." "That seems lonely," I said. The words came out before I'd decided to say them, honest and plain, the way things escape when you're too tired to maintain the careful container you keep them in. Something moved in his face. Not the almost reaction from the night before. Something deeper. Something that surfaced briefly and was not entirely suppressed before it went back down. "Go to your quarters," he said, quiet as the torches. I went. Behind me, as the door swung shut, I heard nothing. No voice, no footstep, no sound at all. But somehow that silence followed me all the way up the stairs. The full moon passed. I knew it the morning after because the east tower door stood open when I arrived at first light, the corridor empty and clean swept, the cages standing wide with their bars pulled back like the pages of a finished book. The straw was gone, the pails removed, and the only evidence that anything living had occupied that underground passage was the faint warmth still lingering in the stone. The ghost of body heat in cold rock, fading fast. I stood in the empty corridor for a moment longer than was necessary. Then I went back upstairs and reported to Marta, who reassigned me to the great hall linens without comment, and I told myself that was the end of it. it was not the end of it. 3 days after the full moon, I was carrying a stack of folded tablecloths through the eastern gallery when I heard my name. Not called, said. The distinction mattered. It was spoken at a normal conversational volume, to someone else, in a room I was passing rather than entering, and the voice that spoke it was one I would have recognized in a crowded market or at the bottom of a well. I stopped outside the gallery door. Sadie. Leander's voice, and then a pause, and then another voice, older, measured, carrying the particular dryness of a man who had spent decades advising powerful people and had long since stopped being surprised by them. The servant girl from the lower ward. She's not a servant girl. A beat. Flat. Certain. She's a woman, and she serves the keep, which makes her a member of this household, not a category. Silence from the older voice. The silence of someone recalibrating. I pressed myself against the wall beside the door and breathed very carefully. As you say, my lord. The advisor's voice smoothed back into its professional texture. I only meant to clarify which individual you were. I know what you meant. Not unkind, not warm. Simply closing a door on a particular direction of conversation. Has Marta been given the revised assignment? It has been, my lord, if I may. A careful pause. Reassigning a general scrubbing hand to personal keep attendance is irregular. The other servants will notice. There will be talk. There is always talk, Leander said. What else? Another pause, longer this time, weighted with something the advisor was deciding whether to say. The Council of Lords meets in a fortnight. Lord Varen has already sent word that he intends to raise the matter of household arrangements. He uses that phrase loosely. Lord Varen, Leander said, in the tone a man uses for a persistent minor inconvenience that has not yet risen to the level of warranting actual attention, is welcome to raise whatever he wishes. It will be addressed. My lord. Dismissed, Edwin. Footsteps. I moved quickly, turning the corner before the advisor emerged from the gallery, and I walked fast and deliberate back toward the linen room with my stack of tablecloths and my heart doing something complicated in my chest. She's not a servant girl. I folded tablecloths for the next hour and thought about nothing else. The revised assignment came through Marta by evening. I was to join the rotation of keep attendants, a small, select group responsible for the maintenance of the upper household, the king's personal corridors, the great hall, and the council chamber. It was a significant elevation from general scrubbing hand, the kind of reassignment that normally followed months of exemplary service and a formal recommendation. I had been in the keep for 3 weeks. Petra found me after supper with wide eyes and lowered voice, pulling me into the alcove near the bread ovens where the kitchen noise would cover conversation. They're saying the king requested you specifically, she said. Marta reassigned me, I said carefully. Marta reassigns people when the king tells her to. Petra searched my face with the earnestness of someone genuinely worried. Sadie, I like you. I want to say something as someone who likes you. Say it. And the last woman the king took personal notice of. She stopped, reconsidered her phrasing. There was a noblewoman 2 years ago, Lady Cressida of the Northern Reaches. Very beautiful, very ambitious, very certain that the king's attention meant something specific. Petra pressed her lips together. It didn't end badly, but it didn't end well, and Lady Cressida had rank and family to return to. You have, she gestured gently, at the bread ovens, at the stone walls, at the general situation. I understand, I said. I don't think you do quite. But she said it without unkindness, and she squeezed my arm before she left, and I stood in the alcove for a while after, listening to the bread ovens tick. I understood better than Petra thought. I had grown up watching my mother arrange her expectations carefully downward, accommodating reality by reducing what she wanted from it until wanting itself became a kind of danger. I had promised myself, at some age young enough that I couldn't now precisely name it, that I would not do the same. The king had noticed me. That was a fact. What it meant was not yet a fact, and I would not build a structure on a foundation that hadn't been laid yet. I went to bed. The upper keep was a different world from the lower corridors. The floors were dressed stone rather than bare rock. The walls hung with tapestries in deep reds and forest greens. The windows tall enough to let real light in rather than the gray suggestion of it. The keep attendants moved through these spaces with a practiced quiet. 4 of us in total. Myself, an older woman named Heloise who had served the keep for 20 years and communicated primarily through pointed silence, a gentle-mannered man called Fen, who was responsible for the hearths and candles, and a sharp-eyed young woman named Isolde, who had been in the upper rotation for 8 months and regarded my arrival with an assessment that was not quite hostile, but was not far from it. "You'll take the eastern corridor," Heloise told me on the first morning, handing me a cloth and a candle. "Twice daily. Don't disturb anything on the writing table. Don't open the chest by the window. Don't enter the inner room unless specifically instructed." "Whose corridor is it?" I asked, though some part of me had already assembled the answer from available pieces. Heloise looked at me with 20 years of keep service in her eyes. "You know whose it is." She walked away. I stood at the entrance to the eastern corridor with my cloth and my candle and looked down its length, quieter than the rest of the upper keep, the tapestries here darker, the colors older. At its far end, a door. Heavy oak, iron-banded, with a carved wolf's head at its center that was not decorative so much as declarative. I began to clean. I had been working for perhaps half an hour, moving through the corridor with methodical care, when I became aware that the door at the far end had opened. I did not look up. I had learned, in the East Tower, that this was often the better choice. Not from submission, but from the simple practical wisdom that looking up changed the situation, and I preferred to understand a situation before I changed it. Footsteps. Closer. Stopping. "You're early," said Leander. Heloise said first light, I said, to the tapestry I was carefully straightening. First light is earlier than I generally encounter staff in this corridor. I'll adjust my schedule. A pause. I heard him move, not away, but to the side, toward the window at the corridor's midpoint, where gray morning light was beginning to strengthen. When I finally allowed myself to glance in his direction, he was standing with one hand braced against the window frame, looking out at the courtyard below. He had not yet dressed fully for court, no formal overrobe, just dark trousers and a loose linen shirt, his dark hair unordered, and the absence of all his formal trappings made him look simultaneously less and more, less the king, more the weight beneath the title. "The 5 in the lower ward," he said, still looking out the window. "They've asked about you." I kept my hands moving on the tapestry. "Have they?" "Corvin says you speak to them as though they're people." "They are people." He turned from the window then, and I felt his gaze even before I met it. Not everyone sees it that way. The power that lives in them during the moon days. It frightens people. It should frighten people. There's wisdom in that fear. "There's a difference," I said carefully, "between wisdom and blindness." The corridor was very quiet. "Yes," he said after a moment. "Just that." The single word carrying more weight than a longer answer would have. I moved to the next tapestry. He remained at the window, and we occupied the corridor together in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which was itself surprising enough that I noted it, filed it, and kept cleaning. Sadie. My name in his voice, direct and deliberate now, rather than the overheard casualness of the gallery. I stopped. "Why did you volunteer for the lower ward?" I considered the honest answer, found it was the only one I had. "Because someone had to," I said, and I grew up understanding that someone is usually whoever stops waiting for someone else. The silence that followed was long enough that I thought perhaps he wouldn't respond. Then I heard him push off the window frame, heard his footsteps resume their unhurried passage toward the far door. "Report to the Great Hall this evening," he said, as he reached it. "There is a council dinner. I'll need the upper household present." He opened the door. "And Sadie." I looked up fully for the first time. He was half in shadow, the carved wolf at the door center just above his shoulder. "You straightened the third tapestry incorrectly," he said. "It hangs 2 inches left of center. I notice because I pass it every morning." He was gone before I could answer. I turned back to the tapestry, found he was precisely right, adjusted it 2 inches, and stood for a moment looking at it hanging straight and even in the gray morning light. Something in my chest did a thing I didn't have a name for yet. I went back to work. The council dinner was nothing like I had expected, and I had expected very little. I had attended enough great hall gatherings in my 3 weeks at the keep to understand the basic architecture of them. The long tables, the candlelight, the careful arrangement of rank made visible through seating and serving order, the way power expressed itself in who spoke first and who waited. I had moved through those evenings as all the household staff did, quiet and peripheral, part of the room's machinery rather than its meaning. The council dinner was different. It was smaller, for one thing. Only the high table occupied, perhaps 14 lords and their senior advisors arranged along its length, with Leander at the center and the careful geometry of allegiance arranged outward from him in both directions. The men who sat closest to him were older, settled into their authority the way stone settles into earth, and they spoke with the ease of people accustomed to being heard. The men farther from the center were younger, sharper-edged, watching the closer men with the particular attention of those who are calculating distance. I moved along the periphery with Eloise and Fen and Isolde, filling cups, replacing candles, maintaining the invisible infrastructure that allowed powerful people to feel comfortable enough to speak freely. I noticed Lord Varon immediately. He was perhaps 50, broad across the shoulders, with silver-streaked hair worn long, and a face that had once been handsome, and now was something more complicated, a face that had learned to arrange itself for effect. He sat 4 seats from Leander's right, which was close enough to matter and far enough to chafe, and he spoke often, filling conversational space with the practiced ease of a man who understood that silence at a table like this was a form of concession. He was also, I noticed, watching me. Not the way Aldrich watched, with the scholar's cataloging interest. Not the way Corvin watched, with the hawk's steady awareness. Lord Varon watched me the way a man watches something he is trying to find the weakness in, and the steadiness of his attention had a quality that made the back of my neck feel cold, in a way the East Tower never had. I kept my face neutral, and my movements precise, and did not look at him directly. The dinner progressed through its courses. The conversation moved through trade agreements and border concerns, and the maintenance of roads in the Western Territories, the kind of weighty, practical business that was the actual substance of governance beneath the ceremonial surface. I listened without appearing to listen, a skill I had developed young, in a house where information was currency, and you learned to gather it quietly or not at all. It was during the 3rd course that Lord Varon spoke, and the room changed. My Lord King. His voice, smooth and carrying, cutting across a smaller conversation that had been building at the table's far end. "I wonder if we might address a matter of household arrangement." The phrase was familiar to me. The phrase Leander's advisor Edwin had used. Household arrangements. A container deliberately too small for what it held. Leander set down his cup with the unhurried precision of a man who had heard exactly what was coming and had prepared for it long before it arrived. "Speak plainly, Varon." A shift around the table, subtle, the collective adjustment of men who could feel the temperature change and were deciding which way to lean. Lord Varon smiled. It was a well-constructed smile. "There is talk among the staff, and where there is talk among the staff, It moves eventually to the village. And where it moves to the village, it shapes perception of the crown. He paused, allowing the shape of his concern to seem civic before he narrowed it. A keep servant, elevated without precedent to personal household attendance, assigned to the lower ward during the moon days, alone, unchaperoned, in proximity to the king's own guard in their most volatile state. He let the word sit. It raises questions about judgment. The table was very quiet. I was at the sideboard behind and to the left of the assembly, replacing a spent candle, and I kept my hands absolutely still and my breathing even and my face a wall. "Whose judgment?" said Leander. Not a question. Varen's smile adjusted slightly. "The household's, naturally. One wonders whether appropriate care is being taken. For the girl's protection, of course. A young woman of no rank, no family connections here, placed in irregular circumstances. It invites speculation that perhaps... Enough. One word." The table went still the way a forest goes still before a storm. Complete, immediate, and deeply aware. Leander looked at Lord Varen with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Not anger. Anger was too simple a word for it. It was the expression of something very old and very certain, looking at something that has made the mistake of assuming uncertainty. "The members of my household," he said, each word placed with deliberate weight, "are under my protection. Their assignments are mine to make. Their presence in any part of this keep is mine to authorize." A pause. "If there is a question of judgment being raised at this table, Lord Varen, I would suggest examining the judgment that prompted the question." Silence. Varen held the king's gaze for exactly 3 seconds. I counted, before looking away. The motion was small, but in the language of that room, it was enormous. The conversation resumed. Other lords reached for cups, turned to neighbors, allowed the moment to be covered by the ordinary sounds of a dinner continuing. But several sets of eyes moved, briefly, to me at the sideboard, and I understood that I had become, in the last few minutes, something more visible than I had ever intended to be. Isolde appeared at my elbow, replacing candles beside me with focused precision, and without looking at me said very quietly, "Varen doesn't let things go." "I know the type," I murmured. She glanced at me sideways, the first look she had given me that wasn't a measurement. "You handled yourself." I stood at a sideboard. "With 14 lords and the king in the room and your name in Varen's mouth," she said. "Standing still is handling yourself." She moved away before I could respond, and I was left with the candle and the quietly resuming dinner and the particular understanding that things had shifted tonight in ways I couldn't yet see the full shape of. Afterwards, when the lords had departed and the hall was being cleared, Leander remained at the high table. This was unusual enough that Heloise gave me a look I couldn't entirely interpret before gathering the other attendants and directing them toward the far end of the hall, leaving me nearest the high table with a cloth and the last of the evening's candles to collect. I worked methodically, moving along the table from the far end inward. The hall was quiet, except for the soft sounds of cleaning and the fire settling in the great hearth. Leander sat with a cup of wine and a document he appeared to be reading, though I noticed after several minutes that he had not turned the page. I reached the section of the table nearest him and began clearing carefully. "You heard," he said, without looking up from the document. "I was in the room," I said, which was the most careful version of yes I could construct. He set down the document, looked at the fire. "Varen is not wrong that your elevation is irregular. He is wrong about everything else." I kept moving along the table. "He worries about perception. Varen worries about power. Perception is the tool he uses." Leander turned his cup slowly in his hand. "He has been trying to find purchase on something for 2 years. He believes a crack exists somewhere, and he is simply looking for the correct place to apply pressure." I considered this. Does a crack exist? He looked at me then, directly, with an expression that was entirely unguarded for one brief moment. And in that moment, I saw something I had not expected to see on a face that carried so much authority. Not vulnerability, exactly. Something older than vulnerability. The particular exhaustion of someone who has held a structure together for so long that they can no longer remember what it felt like before the holding. Every structure has cracks, he said. The question is whether the person looking for them is strong enough to use what they find. I set down the last of the collected candles and looked at him directly in return. And is he? Leander was quiet for a long moment. The fire spoke in the hearth. Not yet, he said. I picked up my basket, prepared to withdraw. The evening had carried enough weight, and I was practical enough to know when a room needed to be left with its silences intact. Sadie, I paused. What Varen said. He stopped. Began again. The words he used, about your situation here. I want you to know that. Another stop, and I understood that this was unusual. That Leander was not a man who stopped often, who searched for words often, who found himself in the position of needing to reach for something, and discovering the reach was unfamiliar. I know, I said gently. Thank you. He looked at me with that unguarded expression again, and this time it lasted a breath longer before the familiar weight came back down over it. You should sleep, he said. Tomorrow the 5 return to the upper ward. Corvin has already sent word asking whether you'll continue their morning provisions. Despite the evening, despite Varen, despite the complicated architecture of everything, something warm moved through my chest. I'll be there, I said. I left him with the fire and the unread document, and the wine going cool in his hand, and I climbed the stairs to the servants' quarters, and I lay on my thin mattress, and for the first time in days, I slept deeply and without interruption. Outside, somewhere in the upper ward, a wolf howled once, low and brief, and was answered by silence. But it was a full silence, a settled one, the kind that meant all is well, all is accounted for. I closed my eyes and let it carry me down. Winter came to the keep, the way it always does in old stone places, not all at once, but in increments, each morning a little colder than the last, the light thinning and the shadows thickening, until one day you realize the world has quietly rearranged itself around you, and you have simply been living inside the change without noticing its arrival. I noticed other things instead. I noticed that Corvin had begun saving the carved pieces he whittled during the long evenings and leaving them at the edge of his provision panel. A small wolf, a bird, mid-flight, a stag with its head raised, not offered directly, just placed where they could be found, which I understood as the particular generosity of a proud man who had not yet developed the vocabulary for a simpler gesture. I kept each one. I noticed that Rowan had begun asking me questions during the morning rounds, careful, thoughtful questions about the village I had come from, about what I had observed in the keep, about what I thought of this lord or that policy, and that he listened to my answers with the full attention of a man who had decided my perspective was worth cataloging alongside everything else he kept. I noticed that Brennan had stopped warning me away from things and had started instead warning me toward them. Small navigational gifts, information offered casually about which corridors to avoid when certain lords were in conference, which hours were safest for moving between the upper and lower keep unobserved. I noticed that Gareth, who still had not spoken a single word to me, had twice positioned himself between me and Lord Varen's attendants when our paths crossed in the upper gallery, a movement so subtle it might have been coincidence, except that it happened twice, at different hours, in different configurations, and coincidence does not repeat itself with that kind of precision. And I noticed Aldrich watching all of this with quiet satisfaction, as though a theory he had been developing was proving itself out exactly as predicted. You've become part of the household, he told me one morning, in that direct way of his that bypassed the ordinary social ceremonies around difficult observations. Not the Keep's household, ours. I looked at him. Is that a warning? It's an observation. He tilted his head. Though it carries implications that are worth sitting with. I sat with them. Lord Varen made his move on a Tuesday. I knew it was his move because it had the shape of something planned. Too neat, too timed. The kind of event that presents itself as accident while carrying the precise geometry of intention. I was in the eastern corridor, straightening the tapestries in the gray morning light, when two of Varen's attendants appeared at the corridor's entrance. They were polite. Professionally so. They told me that Lord Varen had requested the upper household staff assist with the preparation of the council chamber for an emergency session, and that Heloise had sent them to collect me specifically. Something in me went still and careful. I'll verify with Heloise directly, I said pleasantly. The attendants exchanged a brief look, the half-second recalibration of people whose script has encountered an unanticipated response. Of course, said the nearer one smoothly. Though the session begins within the hour, and there is some urgency. Then I'll be quick, I said, and walked past them toward the main corridor before they could reposition. I found Heloise in the linen room. She had sent no such message. Her expression when I told her what had occurred was the expression of a woman who had served 20 years in a place like this and recognized a maneuver when it was described to her. She said, without inflection, "Go to the king." "He'll be in morning council." "Go to the king," she repeated. And the steadiness in her voice was not urgency, but something older than urgency. The voice of someone who understood that certain moments require you to move toward the difficult thing rather than around it. I went. The council chamber anteroom was guarded, as always, by two of the king's senior guard. They knew my face by now. 3 months of upper household service had accomplished that much. And when I told them quietly that I needed to speak with the king on a matter of some importance, they consulted each other with a look, and then one of them slipped inside. He returned in under a minute. "He'll see you." The council chamber was occupied by Leander and Edwin, and 2 senior lords I recognized from the dinner, all of them arranged around a table spread with maps and documents. They looked up when I entered. I kept my eyes on Leander and told him, plainly and briefly, what had happened. The room was very quiet when I finished. Leander looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at Edwin, who had gone very still in the way of someone who is rapidly assembling the implications of new information and does not like what the assembly is producing. "Where is Varen now?" said Leander. Not to me, to the room. "In his chambers, my lord," said one of the senior lords carefully. "He sent word this morning that he was unwell and would not attend today's session." "Convenient," said Leander, in the tone that was not quite any emotion but contained all of them. He stood, looked at me again, and this time the look was different from any that had come before. Not the assessment of the first night in the corridor, not the complicated, unguarded thing by the fire. This was simpler and more complete. The look of a man who has been shown something clearly and has decided what it means. "You did well," he said. "Go to Eloise. Stay in the upper household corridors until I send word." I nodded and withdrew. I learned the rest from Aldrich. 3 days later, when the moon days brought them back to the lower ward, and I came with my provisions and my bucket and my steadiness, same as always. Varen had been called before the king that afternoon. The evidence, assembled, Aldrich implied, with contributions from sources he declined to specify, but which I suspected included Rowan's careful observations and Brennan's corridor intelligence, had been precise and sufficient. There was no dramatic confrontation, no public spectacle. Leander was not a man who required theater. Lord Varen had been relieved of his seat on the council, his holdings in the eastern territories placed under review, and he had departed the keep before the evening bell, with the quiet thoroughness of someone who understands that the alternative is considerably worse. "No violence," I said. "None," Aldrich confirmed. "The king finds it inefficient." A pause. He also finds it beneath the situation, when the situation has already been resolved by other means. I thought about that. About a kind of power that didn't need to be demonstrated loudly because it was simply true, the way gravity is simply true, always present, requiring no performance. "And the rest of you?" I asked. Corvin from his cage. "We're fine, Sadie." Rowan from his, "Entirely well. Thank you for asking." Brennan, quieter. "Better than before, I think." Gareth said nothing, but he looked at me directly for the first time and gave a single slow nod. I looked at Aldrich last. "You knew," I said. "That morning, you'd already seen the pattern." "I had a theory," he said, with careful precision. "You confirmed it." "What was the theory?" He was quiet for a moment, turning it over. Then, that the thing Varin was looking for, the crack in the structure, wasn't a weakness at all. It was the newest and most unexpected load-bearing piece. He met my eyes. "You," and that he had fundamentally misunderstood what he was looking at. Leander found me in the eastern corridor that evening, the last light of a winter afternoon coming thin and gold through the high windows, the tapestries hanging straight and even on the walls. He stood beside me and looked at the corridor the way I had come to understand he looked at things he considered his, with a quiet, complete attention that was not possessiveness, but something more careful than that. Stewardship, perhaps. The awareness of a man who understood that what he was responsible for required tending. "You're staying," he said. It was not entirely a question. "I live here," I said. The corner of his mouth moved, the closest thing to a smile I had seen on him, brief and real. "You do." We stood together in the corridor for a while, the winter light moving slowly across the stones. He did not reach for my hand, and I did not reach for his, but the space between us had the quality of something that had been decided. Quietly, without ceremony, in the accumulated weight of morning corridors and firelit halls and underground passages that smelled of iron and rain. Eventually he said, "The council requires a formal appointment for the upper household senior attendant. The position has been empty for 2 years. I looked at him. "It would require," he continued, with the careful precision of a man choosing words that carry more than they appear to, "a permanent commitment to this household, to this keep." A pause. "To its lord." The winter light touched the carved wolf at the far door. The corridor was warm and still. "Yes," I said, "not to the position, to all of it, to the 5 in the lower ward who had made room for me in their particular world, to Heloise and her pointed silences and her 20 years of steady knowledge, to Petra and her worried kindness and the bread ovens and the thin mattress I had, without quite noticing, begun to think of as home, to the man standing beside me in the afternoon light, who had called me his before he understood what he meant by it, and who now understood completely. He looked at me for a long moment. That full, unguarded look, nothing held back, nothing managed. "Good," he said quietly. Outside, the first snow of winter had begun to fall, soft and unhurried, settling over the courtyard and the battlements and the old stone walls of the keep with the patience of something that has always known it would arrive here eventually. Inside, the tapestries hung straight. The corridor was warm, and I was exactly where I had decided to be.